Welcome to the Payroll Podcast with your host, Nick Day. Find out what it takes to truly discover what it takes to elevate your career within payroll as we meet with the industry leaders who are shaping the industry for tomorrow.
Hello and welcome back to the Payroll Podcast. My name is Nick Day, CEO at JGA Recruitment Group, specialist global payroll recruiters. It's sunny outside. We've got some sunny payroll experts to guide you through some interesting topics as well. We have Rachel Giles join us for the first time as our resident panel expert covering all issues related to employment law from DWF. And she's going to talk to us about tribunal compensations, which may well result in us chatting a little bit about the P&O ferry situation, sackings and redundancies, which I know is hot news right now. So let's have a look at today's discussion topics then. The first one is the end of COVID-19 emergency measures. We're going to be talking about the national minimum wage increase, tribunal compensation, and we may, if we can, find time to talk about the P&O situation as well, pensions, auto-enrolment, and gender pay gap reporting. Let's jump in then to this topic. I know the first part quite well because I had to fill in a travel locator form just yesterday. I came back from Spain, and I believe that was the last possible day I had to do it. Had I flown back today, I wouldn't have had to. So mask on the plane, mask in the airports, and I believe those restrictions have now been lifted. But let's perhaps start with you on this, Rachel. End of COVID-19 emergency measures, end of travel restrictions. What does this mean?
Well, end of travel restrictions. I don't know if any of you are based in the Northwest, but I'm sure you saw on the news last night the 2.5-hour queues at Manchester Airport to go through security. So I think that's probably the end of travel restriction impact. In terms of business travel, which is something that I've been thinking about for clients, yes, it will have an impact. You know, people will be moving around more. I think there has been business travel domestically, internationally there hasn't been, but that's going to increase. But I think clients are definitely thinking about the necessity of business travel now, and that there's certainly been the move to trade shows, conferences, webinars all being held virtually, and I think that's the way it will stay. You know, clients are looking at bottom line, they're looking at the impact on the environment, and they're really now thinking, can we just adopt tech platforms in order to remove the requirement for business travel? Yeah,
excellent. And so it all came in, I think, pretty much from today. How does this impact the payroll side of things then? We talked a little bit from the poll there, Simon, but it's the end of SSP enhancements as well. What does this mean for payroll?
Yeah, sure. So just so that people understand, for those of you that were employers of under 250 employees, you did have the opportunity to reclaim up to 2 weeks worth of COVID-related absence and as SSP payments from the government. That ended last night. So any COVID-related absence from today, you can't reclaim. So you may have obligations still to pay the SSP, but you can't get it back from the government anymore. And it's a little bit harder than that in the fact that any reclaim has to be made by the 24th of March at midnight. And that's when all the emergency COVID legislation falls to one side. So that was its natural death anyway. So it all comes to an end. So the claim up to the 17th for payments of SSP that you're claiming back must be completed by the 24th. If not, you can't claim it, even if it related to earlier absence. Now, I think there's a lot of discussion around, I think, Nick, I don't know if you're seeing it as well, of people saying, well, we wouldn't have paid that till the end of March anyway, so how can we claim that in time? And I think there's an element of, with a little bit of jiggery pokery and magic, you've got to make a claim by next week and as if you've paid it. So there's an element of you may have to think about it. Otherwise, you can't get back the 2 times £96.35.
What about to reverse
the other
slightly, Simon? So what if you've found out that you've overclaimed? Is that something that may happen? A way to reclaim? Just thinking, I'm sure this is something that might pop up.
No, overclaims may have occurred, and you need to make those corrections, HMRC would say, by the 24th. If not, if it's discovered you've overclaimed, you may find it then gets into a more serious position of investigation or penalty. So there is an obligation on employers to get their SSP claims correct by the 24th. The other aspect that comes to an end, which is all part of that 24th of March date, is the fact that the emergency measures for COVID-19 absence was that you would qualify, as long as you had a 4-day period of incapacity for work, you would qualify for SSP from day one of the qualifying days, your normal working days. That ends from the 25th, it's day 4. So the first 3 days are again waiting days. Of course, unless you're linked to prior absences, which keep a linking going. But if it's a fresh absence, no absence for 56 days, new, and it's COVID related, you wait 3 days before you're entitled to SSP.
Just bringing it back to yourself, Rachel, and just a question that's popped into my head here, and it'd be interesting to know how this is managed. If now that the restrictions have been lifted, not just in terms of travel, but in terms of being able to return to the workplace, regardless of your COVID status to a certain degree, if you've got someone working in an office who is against the vaccination, hasn't been vaccinated, and is continuing to work, and you've got someone who has COVID who is entitled to come into work, are there certain processes of obligations an employer has in terms of how that is potentially managed? Because there's a risk element there, I'm sure, which is going to cause some awkward conversations.
Well, yeah, there's always the risk of grievances, and I think now the move is certainly to the burden of care being on the employer. In terms of sort of an anti-vaxxer who potentially an employer may not want within the business, and then there's somebody who is vaccinated and is potentially COVID positive coming into the business. It's something that you need to have these discussions. HR need to be talking about these things now, and just sort of have at least general policies in place about how you're going to deal with these issues. If, you've got the ability to allow people to work from home, then that's an option. It can be looked at. I think most employers won't want their colleagues to come into the office or the workplace if they're COVID positive. I think a high profile case is a large retailer. I won't mention the name in case that they're one of your clients, but they had to publicly apologise for basically saying, come into work, even if you're COVID positive, it's fine. So, we've, as employers, you've still got that duty of care to look after your colleagues. It's a case by case basis. As an employment lawyer, I'm always going to be thinking about disability discrimination, protecting vulnerable colleagues. So it's HR's job to really know everybody's circumstances and to just deal with them as individuals, really. But
maybe this is policy related, but is there any kind of legal obligation for someone who's COVID positive to disclose if they know they're positive to their employer?
No, it's this personal responsibility strapline that we're hearing, and it's completely up to the individual whether they want to disclose that. I mean, as an employer, you could seek to put a policy in place to ask people to tell you, or you could try and put a testing regime in place, which I know a lot of employers will be doing. I think those in the sort of health and social care sector will still have testing regimes in place anyway. But no.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, are our attitudes changing? I mean, I think I've had a light cold this week, or a slight flu, but it's actually COVID. So I did test positive. But in the 3 or 4 years ago, if I'd have had a cold like this, would I have turned up to an office? And I think the answer is yes, I would have done. But will I in future? Because it could have not been COVID, because I've had similar things before and been tested negative. And I probably even felt worse. But on this one, it's fairly light, been triple jabbed, I don't even really know where I got it from. 2 years of, when we did have it in the house, I tested for 10 days, was negative completely a month and a half ago. But this time, no, it shows up. Obviously picked it up. We're all interacting these days, and runny nose and a cough. Will we not go to work with a runny nose and a cough?
I think that leads to probably a question for Rachel. Sorry, how do we then manage those COVID-related absences without the guidelines?
We are expecting guidance. We hoped that we would have it by now. It's new public health guidance that is going to replace the guidance that's in place, and it will remove the COVID-19 risk assessment criteria, but we don't have it. So I think your standard absence policies and your standard disciplinary policies potentially, but it's as ever, it's health and safety and back to the employment contract.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. We're having an amazing day for questions coming in to warn you both, Andy, Simon, and Simon, particularly on the payroll side. Maybe something here for you as well, Rachel, to come through. So let's jump into the next section, because some of these do relate to some of the areas we're going to be discussing, and particularly in relation to salary sacrifice. You can see the bullet points there. Before we jump into this, let's just try and work through a couple of questions, and I'll try and pick and choose as we go to keep them relevant. The first one is this: does anyone who payrolls benefits just check each category to ensure they are covered for everything?
You could do, and I guess that would relieve you of the obligations to P11D. The challenge is that what's needed for the circumstance of your individual employees. Now, the impact of registering is to remove any auto-coding that HMRC do. So in effect, if they think, Simon's had medical insurance last year of £600, he's going to have medical insurance probably of £600 next year, so I'll code that into his tax code. If you register and tick medical insurance and you don't exclude individuals, it'll remove that 60 adjustment from the tax coding. So I won't be taxed in the payroll through my coding, because it's assuming I'll be taxed on the fact that the benefit is declared as taxable income. Now, if you don't then payroll, and I still get the £600 medical benefit, I'm going to get a bill for the tax at the end of the year. Do you see the thing? So there's an element of putting your mind to it to think, what are you wanting to achieve? And the registration in reality is about informing HMRC elements that you want to be taken out of the tax code. However, it is the authority to payroll and P11D. And increasingly, we're seeing that the bulletins are telling us you must stop informal payrolling, register. But as an idea, well, yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it?
Yeah. We've got a question come in from Joe that says, someone at HMRC has told us to register a salary sacrifice scheme, brackets electric car, as a BIK via the payroll benefits portal. Is this correct, as we were under the impression that this was for benefits that will incur a tax charge in payroll rather than relief?
Well, yeah, sorry. An electric car will incur a tax charge. So I think there's an understanding of what it is. So the salary sacrifice is in effect affecting it doesn't give a tax relief. It reduces the amount of taxable income. So you're declaring a much lower earnings amount. But the electric cars are subject to a 1% company car tax charge now. And that applied from 6th of April 2021. And from 6th of April 2022, there is a 2% company car charge, and the employer will owe Class 1A. So, okay, you could say that that's a reduced amount in relation to the reliefs, but they're not the same thing. So I can understand HMRC indicating that actually you need to register for the tax charge. However, are you P11Ding the benefit? And if you're P11D the benefit, then I'd say you don't have to register, because you're not payrolling. All you're doing is applying a salary sacrifice arrangement.
Yeah, that makes sense. And last one before we do jump into this. Thank you for the questions coming in, everyone. This is amazing. There's more to get through, but I'm going to keep some of these relevant to the topics as we go through. So some of them, if I don't ask them now, that's the reason why, but I will get to them. The last one for now. An employee has requested salary sacrifice for workplace nursery through Enjoy benefits. I'm not convinced it is 100% HMRC compliant. What are your thoughts?
Is it a workplace nursery? That's my initial thought. And if it's not, it won't work. So I think there's an element of looking at the approved workplace nursery criteria to see if it is a workplace nursery, because it might not be. Just because you call something doesn't mean it is.
Yeah, absolutely right. That's a famous Simon Jordan. If you're one of those lights listen to Simon Jordan, says that quite regularly. Yeah, yes. Absolutely. Let's dive in then to the national minimum wage.
Because I doubt it that employer's workplace nursery at all.
No, indeed.
That's the challenge, isn't it?
So national minimum wage increases, salary sacrifice, and some impacts here. Let's start with yourself, Simon. Let's have a bit of an overview if we can, and then I'm sure some questions are going to follow, and then we can jump into the impacts on maternity and Alabaster.
Yeah, sure. This is a subject we've covered before, but let's cover it again. And that's because it's only a short while away, but the end of, was it the week after, 2 weeks today, national insurance rates go up. And they go up quite significantly. So 6.9% rise for national living wage is a significant rise. And so people will be getting their earnings rising for certainly the lower paid, closer to the limits on salary sacrifice schemes. So the fact that they've got a pre-existing childcare voucher arrangement, which they've had since before 2018 when it ended, but they carry on, of £50 a week. If that £50 now takes their pay below national minimum wage, the employer's in breach of minimum wage law and could be in trouble. So there's what do you do about it? And because we're having these high minimum wage increases, this is increasingly hitting that barrier of breach risk for employers as we get closer. So what do you do? Do you take the bike off them? Do you stop the vouchers? Do you take their eco car off them? There's all these things just got to be very careful of, and have you properly considered the salary sacrifice implications from first pay period starting on or after 1st of April 2022. So that initial thought there. For some of the lower rates, it's much higher. So the 21 and 22-year-olds have had 11 point something hike in their minimum wage, because I think you're seeing that the direction of travel here is that the government are lowering the national living wage to the age of 21 eventually. And how have they done that? They've halved the gap. And so there's a significant rise for 21, 22-year-olds. Are they in that group? And that affects pension salary sacrifice as well, bringing in Andy here. So what are you going to do? Because you've contractually agreed a higher pension contribution as an employer, and you won't have enough money to sacrifice.
Let's pause there. What are the pension considerations then, Andy?
Well, picking up, I'll finish off Simon's point, and Simon may add to that. Yes, so if someone's on a salary sacrifice pension arrangement, and now you've got the national minimum wage increase, which, as Simon says, is quite a chump, sort of 60p type thing, which means that if the salary sacrifice continues, you're reducing the individual below the national minimum wage, so you can't do that. Then you need to see what your scheme rules say, but the norm would be that the salary sacrifice agreement has actually ended, because logically in your salary sacrifice agreement you've got national minimum wage phrasing in there, or you've got somewhere of it ending anyway. You need to look at that contract between the individual and the employer to see what it says, and I'm sure Rachel will have a view on this. But from a practical point of view, what we're saying is that instead of salary sacrifice, the individual is now going to start paying normal contributions. So just do normal, whatever the contributions say, 5%. So 5% will be a pension contribution, which, if it's net pay arrangement, will reduce the taxable pay, but it will come off. It will not be a salary sacrifice arrangement anymore for those people. So that's that bit. I don't know if Rachel wants to add in before I move on to perhaps more considerations on national wage.
No, not really. I think absolutely right. Look at the agreement, but practically, individuals won't understand the complexities of this. So make sure you sit down with your colleagues, you talk to them, you explain why it has to be done. Just that line of communication, keep it open, because people do rely on this, childcare, for example. So yeah, make sure you get HR on board or line management on board to explain the implications.
There is a question here, Andy, that's come in actually, which you may be able to answer. Comes in from Susie. So thank you for the question, Susie. So can I just check how salary sacrifice pensions should be processed whilst on maternity? We enhance salary to 100% in the first 6 weeks and then 50% or full pay up to the 6-month mark.
Right. So several things here to think about. First of all, let's look at the employee side of things. So, because we ought to discuss salary sacrifice and non-salary sacrifice. So let's just want to make the picture clear for the non-salary sacrifice. So an individual in the pension scheme paying normal contributions, they go on maternity leave. During the maternity pay period, so up to 39 weeks when they're receiving SMP, then during that period, the individual will pay contributions based on what they're actually receiving. So that would be SMP plus any additional payments that they're receiving based on what the scheme rules determine is pensionable. The employer, though, will pay contributions based on the individual's pay that they would have had they not been on maternity leave. So there'll be a calculation to determine what that person's normal pay is, and the employer will pay contributions based on that normal pay. So the individual pays on actual pay, the employer pays on what would have been paid had they not been on maternity leave for those 39 weeks, up to 39 weeks. So that's normal contribution. So salary sacrifice, of course, is where the individual has agreed to pay, to have a lower salary in exchange for an employer contribution. So another factor to bear in mind is that SMP cannot be salary sacrificed against. So SMP has to be paid in full. You cannot recover any salary sacrifice agreement, so an amount from the SMP payment. So if you look at the employers only paying SMP throughout the whole of that 39 weeks, then, and the individuals that have salary sacrifice agreement in place, then the employer will be paying the full amount, the normal employer contributions plus the salary sacrificed employer contribution, based on the pay that the individual would have had they not been on maternity leave. And the individual will not be contributing towards that because there's nothing for them to contribute from, because SMP cannot be reduced to take account of salary sacrifice values. However, in this example, the employer is paying 100% to start with and then goes to 50%. So if the salary sacrifice agreement, the contractual agreement, includes these payments, the top-up payments, and those top-up payments are enough to meet the salary sacrifice amount, the pension amount, but also other salary sacrifice items, then the employer can reduce those payments by the amount of salary sacrifice that's due, but obviously cannot touch the amount of SMP that has to be paid. So that amount must be paid. So maybe only recover part of that amount. So it's important to check what the contractual agreement is, what is being paid in addition to SMP. Can that be used to offset the salary sacrifice amount due for pension and other salary sacrifice items? Then you can go ahead and process your payroll. But remember, it's based on the pay the individual would have had had they not been on maternity leave.
Wow.
I think that's all. Comes to mind. Yeah. And Alabaster just adds to that, doesn't it? Because if the individual, an Alabaster may impact a national minimum wage increase because the national minimum wage is going up. Someone's on maternity leave at the moment. Alabaster may now be increasing their pay, in which case you're going to have to recalculate maternity pay and therefore all the knock-on effects such as the salary sacrifice, employer contribution and everything else. So it has, Alabaster has has great fun for payroll attached to it. Simon, or do you want to add, or Rachel, anything to what I've just said?
Well, I can talk a little bit more about Alabaster, but I think Andy, that's excellent response there, I think, Nick, and it is complicated.
Yeah.
But in effect, you can't salary sacrifice SMP. It's a state payment. Sometimes we think, well, we're paying some of it, so it's not a state payment. No, it's a state payment. It might be part funded by an employer. It's still a state payment. SSP is actually a state payment. The employer might be funding 100% of it. Makes no difference. It's still a state payment. So you can't salary sacrifice a state payment, and I think that's the important aspect. And then, therefore, you can't move it forward. There are other implications maybe that Rachel might comment is sometimes trying to fix these things inadvertently brings the employer into a case of discrimination. Mm-hmm. So sometimes you try and coerce an employee to stop their pension contribution during maternity because, of course, you won't have enough money to sacrifice. There's an element of they don't need to. And so just be careful, because that's probably, I can't even say indirect discrimination. That's probably direct discrimination.
Yeah,
probably think, Rachel, any thoughts?
Probably that would be potentially direct discrimination. And I think just practical employment law advice, whenever there's an issue in terms of Alabaster or SMP, if you do receive payroll queries, again, just try and flag them to HR if you've got an employee relations team or anyone within HR, because often small payroll queries can lead to bigger discrimination claims. So if you're not working together, then it may end up in the tribunal as not only a pay claim, we've also got a huge discrimination claim as well. So just a practical advice for you payroll practitioners.
Yeah, practical advice, very welcome.
And the other aspect of Alabaster, Nick, is, of course, people think because the rise is the 1st of April, it only applies for SMP from the 1st of April. And it doesn't. Under the Alabaster ruling, it goes back to the beginning of anybody that's on maternity leave on the 1st of April to the beginning of when the calculation. So you may owe SMP top up for past periods before the 1st of April. So it's a pay rise, any pay rise that occurs between the 8 weeks before the 15-week qualifying date through to the end of the additional maternity leave period. Anyone that's been on maternity leave, if that 1st of April date falls in that, there is a recalculation requirement for the whole period. And sometimes we find people finding that really confusing.
Well, a couple of questions. I think people still are seeking just a little bit of final clarification. So let me just sum up these two quick questions, and hopefully we can give everyone the confidence they need to move forward with this. So one says, can I clarify about sacrificing out statutory pay? Is this the count for the full 39 weeks, or can they sacrifice out of the first 6 weeks of higher rate SMP?
No, because it's still a statutory payment. You can't sacrifice any of it.
And that then relates to the second part, which is based on an employee having salary sacrifice pension going on maternity leave. You're essentially saying the employer is responsible for paying the employee's pension contributions up to 39 weeks.
Well, no. I understand what you're saying, but there is no employee contribution. I think we need to be clear on that. When you enter a salary sacrifice agreement, the employee actually contributes nothing ever. What they've done is to agree to a pay cut. That pay cut is already reflected in their average earnings for SMP. I'm not saying that pays for it, because it doesn't, but it's already reflected. What we're saying is you can't take a pay cut of a statutory payment. But the opposite, the associated aspect of taking that pay cut is the employer has made a contractual promise to the individual. That contractual promise is to pay enhanced employer contributions. So I think we need to be clear, when an employee is part of a salary sacrifice arrangement, there is no employee contribution. They're contributing nothing. So if you may have a 5% sacrifice, that 5% isn't an employee pension contribution. It's a 5% pay cut. Then the employer might be enhancing the employer contribution by a 5% contribution. But just want to clarify that. So with salary sacrifice, the employee is buying nothing. The employer is giving. Even with a bike, you're not buying a bike, you're not buying childcare vouchers, because if you are buying childcare vouchers, there is no tax relief. It has to be given by the employer.
Have you ever asked yourself, how can I recruit payroll staff effectively? Please don't give up on your recruitment project just yet. Here at JGA Payroll Recruitment, we appreciate the difficulties associated with attracting, recruiting and retaining top payroll talent. We also understand just how costly a poor payroll hire can be. JGA Recruitment are a niche payroll recruitment agency who will partner with you to resource payroll candidates who will improve both the accuracy and efficiency of your payroll department. Contact us today on 01727 800 377 or visit jgarecruitment.com to find out more.
Being payroll question time as it is, there's a few questions that don't necessarily sit in any of the topics, but obviously people want some answers. They've come to the webinar to join. So I'm going to run through some of these before we join into our next topic, because I'm just going to get into a little bit deep into the P&O situation and beyond.
Nick, before you do the questions, can I just add a couple of things on the... Are we going to move off national minimum wage after this, or are we going to continue?
How about we finalise national wage here? So if you jump in, Andy, then I'll go through some of these questions before we go into the next topic.
Two points then.
Of course.
One is on the whole pension contribution during someone on maternity leave. Remember to check the scheme rules, because the pension scheme may have a greater
recruitment.com to find out more
than the statutory minimum. So, it could be, you just need to make sure that the pension scheme rules aren't requiring more than what you might be expecting. So just check the scheme rules for people when on maternity leave. The other thing is national minimum wage increase means that there's going to be people who are going to be paid more in April than they were previously, and it's possible that they'll now trigger for the first time automatic enrolment. So you may have a little blip of people being automatically enrolled in April, and they may, of course, choose to opt out. So there may be an additional bit of extra work for payroll people in April because of the national minimum wage increase. That's me done on national
that makes sense. I'm glad you jumped in. Excellent. So a quick question for you here, Simon, relates to national insurance contribution increases. What is the opinion on the HMRC request to put a payslip message on every month?
Yes. Do you want me to give you a personal opinion, or the HMRC are asking everyone, and I'll use my irony here a little bit. Pretty please, would you put a message on the payslip for the 2022-23 tax year? There's no mandation to do it. It's not a requirement of law, and the reason it's sometimes questioned is because the health and social care levy does fund health and social care in England. That money will be allocated to the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly and Northern Ireland Assembly as well, but what they do with it is up to them. So is that going to actually fund health and social care in those nations? Because actually the health and social care levy 1.25 percentage points amount is funding health and social care in England. So does that kind of give a view? So some will say it's a political message. Others will say, oh, just get on with it and do it. All I can say is if you want to do it, the capability is there to do it.
The next bit, which may be more relevant for this, potentially for the spring statement section we've got coming up, but I know this is a hot topic at the moment as well with where we are. So the question I've come in is this. With fuel increases going up so much, are the fuel advisory rates likely to change, even though they haven't changed for over 10 years? I don't know if anyone knows the answer to this. I do know that I read an article on, I think it was the Daily Mail that published it, which said that it was by This Is Money, where they said that prices would have to increase to about £3.50 per litre for car mileage allowances to go into the red. I'll put a link to that article if anyone's interested in it. But be interested to know your thoughts on the fuel increases going up. Will that be adjusted as a result?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it, Nick? I mean, it would be nice. I mean, I don't know how you operate your cars, but I've got an electric car, well, hybrid, as we've talked about before, yeah. Nick. I think you have as well these days. So, not the best. It's Mercedes, but it's good for me, and I like it. And I've got to say, over the years, my mileage rates in vehicles I've had has increased and increased. So I get more miles to the gallon in the cars I've had over the past 5 years than I did over the previous 15 years. But the rates stayed the same. So actually, have I profited from that 45p for the first 10,000 miles and 25p thereafter? And I'd probably say over the years, it's actually bought the cars. If you want to know how, I've probably got formulas and Excel spreadsheets that will show how, but it's kind of self-funded itself in many ways, because I was doing between 14 and 20,000 business miles a year, amongst other things as well. Don't know. I think, is it people saying it's getting to a point that the 45p doesn't cover the insurance, etc.? Because I'm probably feeling it does, and that's probably the view the HMRC will have, is that it's not hit that crunch point. So your comment about the £3 odd a litre is possibly true. It was quite generous. It started out as 40p, didn't it? And then it jumped to 45, and it's stayed there ever since. So HMRC may have taken the view that it was actually too generous.
Could be a good government win, though, potentially in a statement for those that are feeling the pinch, which is interesting to see if that might come out. Roger's actually posted a comment here to say, I doubt fuel rates will increase, in my opinion, because look at the tax fee redundancy at 30k. When was that ever increased? There you go. It probably links nicely into our next section, to be honest. We'll jump into that in just a moment, but we'll keep the slide in front of us. We're going to talk about tribunal compensation in just a second. Last question here. Are you aware of what happens to the apprenticeship levy when we do not use the money? How is it being spent?
The government will say thank you, in effect. So yes, it is a levy. Sometimes eventually, I think I'm saying this from memory, so forgive me a little. I think after a period of 2 years, you lose access to any allocated money that you have available to you. At that point, then, I think it will go into the general apprenticeship funding sort of arena, because you actually get a 10% top up. But there are different funding arrangements across the devolved governments as well. So there is a share that's going to the Scottish Parliament, Northern Ireland Assembly, and the Welsh Assembly, which funds their apprenticeship funding. So that's not controlled by you, that's controlled by them. So you may find it spent on institutions or schemes or various things like that. But in effect, will go into the public purse for spending on apprenticeships.
Right, and an interesting comment here, just linking back to our last subject of COVID-19 emergency measures from Gemma Liff, who says, it's not a question, but I did want to share with the audience today that we've created a new permitted leave reason for isolating for those positive employees who are asking to isolate in order to protect their colleagues. This neither uses holiday or sickness entitlement, and they are fully paid. We might like that one, Rachel, just to read that one out.
Brilliant.
And I know we had that complex question, which I know we could leave it till a bit later, but I'm keen to give Jonathan a response. The question initially earlier on today was, can you confirm that outbound expats should be included in the gender pay gap reporting? Now, Ashley Dorman, for those that know him, I know him very well, has come in with an excellent response. I'm going to read out to you all so we can move on from this area, and obviously maybe we can comment on again when we get to that section. But he says, I know the answer to the gender pay gap question for expats posed earlier. An employer that is based in Great Britain who sends employees abroad to work may find that some or all of these employees will need to be counted for the gender pay reporting regulations. Similarly, a multinational organisation that has employees working wholly or partly in Great Britain may also find that some or all of these employees will need to be counted for the gender pay reporting regulations. As a general rule, an employee working overseas will be within the scope of the regulations if they can bring a claim to an employment tribunal under the Equality Act 2010. This will depend on whether the employment relationship suggests a stronger connection to Great Britain and British employment law than to the law of any other country. So hopefully that clears that section up a little bit. Let's jump into the next section then. I'm going to pass this over to Rachel to begin with. I know we're going to talk about Employment Tribunal award limits and changes in compensations, but I wondered, if possible, if we could just start a little bit with the situation that's currently surrounding the P&O sackings and redundancies from yesterday. If there's any information that, I guess, that's come to light, you may be able to impart.
Well, I mean, firstly, just to say that as an employment lawyer, I was absolutely gobsmacked when I heard the news last night. 800 employees, no consultation, shocking. And that's without hearing about the buses full of security guards that were then going to go on to take the employees off, who had just been told via Teams that they were dismissed with immediate effect. In terms of employment law, well, yeah, unfair dismissals, protective award, consultation should have lasted up to 45 days because of the amount of colleagues that were affected. But they've done this for a reason. They won't have done it without advice. They've probably calculated their liabilities and decided that I was going to mention a terrible pun there about sinking, but I won't. Yeah, they will have just decided that better to do it this way and to bring in the agency staff to keep the business afloat. Yeah, it's surprising, and I think a lot of claimant lawyers will probably benefit from this because there will be a lot of unfair dismissal claims in the Employment Tribunal. However, it's going to take them a while to get what they deserve. We had a quick chat prior to this call, and I understand that a lot of the employees will have been offered settlement agreements. So that might be a way to sort of finalise it for them, and get the money that they're owed. You know, there will be people with lengthy careers within the business who quite rightly deserve their redundancy payment and any additional redundancy payments that they're entitled to.
Yeah. I mean, allegedly, and this is just a report I've heard from an HR professional, it basically states that they ran the calculations, decided it's cheaper to take any tribunal or court hit than it is to hold negotiations and risk strikes.
That's really sad, isn't it? You know, a personal view of mine, obviously. I don't act for P&O, but it is really sad, and it makes a mockery of tribunals and employment law legislation. Let's just hope this isn't the sort of the move of industrial relations going forward. I certainly hope not.
Worth also clarifying for those that aren't fully up to speed with this, because there was a tweet that was posted today by P&O Cruises, because this relates to P&O ferries, of course. P&O Cruises put out a tweet earlier today to say, would like to be absolutely clear that P&O Cruises is part of Carnival Corporation and PLC, and as such is entirely unrelated in any way to P&O Ferries, which is owned by DP World. Because we often just talk as P&O on its own without that second part of the company name, and it's probably worth just clarifying the two changes there for those that are not familiar. Well, moving on to employment tribunals, I'm sure there'll be some that come out the back of this. Maybe you can talk us through a little bit, Rachel, about the employment tribunal award limit changes.
Yeah, so the changes will take effect from the 6th of April. That's the date that any dismissal, any termination would have to take effect from the 6th of April for the new awards to apply. That's the same with calculating your statutory redundancy payments as well. So the maximum on a week's pay will go up from the current figure of £544, £571. The maximum compensatory award for unfair dismissal will go up from £89,493 to £93,878. And the minimum basic award for unfair dismissals, which includes health and safety dismissals, goes up from £6,634 to £6,959. That is to say that the limits, you need to take into account that it's limited to 52 weeks pay. If that's lower, than the maximum compensatory award. Going back to P&O, the liability is massive for them. In terms of calculating your redundancy pay for any redundancies that you might be working out within the next couple of weeks, just bear in mind that any termination post the 6th of April, you will be based on the new calculation. But practical advice from me, any consultations that you're currently going through and figures have already been calculated and sent to colleagues, double check that those figures are right if the termination's happening over the 6th of April, because clients do get caught by that.
Yeah,
and
that's a good point.
Yeah, that's it. The Vento award for personal injury damages normally changes. At this point, there hasn't been any announcement on the changes, so it seems that they will be the same as last year, unless I hear otherwise, but take it that they'll remain the same levels.
There's a question that's come in that relates to that redundancy payment. And obviously this is a question for yourself, Rachel, yourself, Simon, but it says if an employee has an outstanding overpayment and they're being made redundant, can you legally recover the net amount when you process that redundancy payment?
Well, I'm going to suggest it depends on the contractual terms of employment. So do you have a clause within your contract that allows you to recover overpayments? If you don't, then I'm going to hazard a guess here and say no. But if you do, possibly.
Yeah, I think it would be very good drafting to have a clause that would refer specifically to redundancy payments. I think as a general rule, you would say no, but check your employment contract.
That's right. But as a general principle, an overpayment is recoverable from an individual. I guess the challenge here is indicating that you don't want to pay it first to then try and recover it. You may have to, I think, is what the suggestion is here, unless you've got a very tight contract which allows you to. But you do have a right to recover. It's just you're then going through other legal processes to recover it. From an HMRC angle, although HMRC may tell you otherwise, legally, if it's an overpayment, it's not earnings. So you can immediately recover tax and national insurance on that amount on the principle that you do intend to recover at some point. And if you have to write it off as your failure to recover, that doesn't always make it taxable. But if you don't intend to recover, it is earnings. And so the overpayment is subject to tax and national insurance.
That's an interesting observation to make. One other question here. I'm going to keep it in this section. It's not related to tribunals necessarily, unless you would take a claim against it if you're unhappy with the result. But the question here is, it's a few in one really. It relates to unused holiday pay. If we have an employee who has unused annual leave left over but has been told they cannot carry it into the new year and that they lose any unused leave as a result, I'm on the understanding that the government said you can carry leave up to 2 years after COVID. Is this incorrect? And if employees are entitled to 5.6 weeks a year, does the employer have an obligation to make them take it?
Well, I could give a couple of views there, Nick. I guess holidays are sort of one of my specialisms, and but because it is, you'll usually get the yes, no, and maybe, and it depends type response. And I think their famous lines, a little bit of John as well, I'd probably suggest Rachel at times, is it depends. But actually, payment in lieu of holiday is unlawful unless they're leaving. So there is this perception of you'll lose it. You can carry over for 2 years due to COVID reasons, holiday entitlements, which would previously under the regulations be unlawful because you couldn't carry forward the EU 4 weeks. You could only carry forward the UK 1.6 weeks. But the emergency laws allow you to carry forward 2 years. But I don't think that's starting to relate to current holidays because we're coming out of the pandemic. So be careful there. But an employer doesn't have to agree to it. So it's not a right. It's an option if the employee and employer agree to it. Otherwise, you may have had employers that during furlough had to pay 100% pay. So there may be reasons why an employer would want to allow it, otherwise they'd have had to pay those employees 5.6 weeks of 100% of their pay due under the regulations for holiday pay, and they may not have been able to afford it. So it's looking at the reasons why you're carrying forward and what. But is there an obligation on employer to ensure that individuals take their holiday? Rachel may have some comments there, but I think principally, no, it's not their obligation to ensure, but it is an employer's obligation to ensure that they have the opportunity to take their holiday. And there may be other comments and views there, but you can't say you can't take holiday when it's due. You have to give them the ability to take the holiday. Any thoughts there, Rachel?
I mean, not much more to add there. You know, that you will have your own holiday policies to follow. It's been a strange few years in terms of holiday, people working when they would have taken their 2 weeks in the sun and they didn't. You know, let's deal with people case by case, good communication. Why haven't people taken their holiday, and reasonableness?
As a question, and this is coming to my mind, it's not a question from the audience, Simon, but something that popped into my head when you mentioned your initial response. If I haven't taken my full entitlement, I've reached the end of the year, and the employer says, you know, even if they allow me to carry it over, but I say actually I'd rather take a payment in lieu of that, but I'm requesting it hasn't been requested by the employer, rather than me carry it over and take more holiday the following year, would that be breaking the law in doing so if that request comes from the employee?
Yeah.
It's unlawful.
Yeah, you can't do it.
Holiday in lieu.
What most people would do is say, just carry it over and take it within the first quarter. That tends to be the main advice that I'd give. You can't do it.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, what people do in arrangements of bonuses and things like that, but potentially the employers opening themselves up to being pursued for not complying with the working time regulations and allowing people to take the 5.6 weeks rest. I think what the law is trying to do is enforce that people have rest.
Yeah,
I guess COVID's been different, I guess, because we've all been at home. And some of us have been twiddling our thumbs. Not any of us as payroll professionals, because I think everybody here that's a payroll professional that's dealt with COVID has probably worked twice the amount of time they would normally.
Absolutely.
And so actually you could probably do with a 5.6 weeks break, but probably don't have the time to take it. Yeah. So it's, you know, sometimes it can be viewed that we've had a bit of a jolly for the past 2 years. In the payroll professional, we've gone grey and lost our hair, haven't we? It's been a real struggle and sometimes exciting and taken our minds off certain distractions, but sometimes driven us all a bit potty.
Yeah, I mean, those brown, long, curly locks you had, Simon, when we started this PQT series many months ago have well and truly gone.
Well, that's right. Well, blondes are flowing, of course, you know.
A good question's come in here from Joanne Chetwood. How does the stringer ruling affect the carry forward holiday when someone has been on long-term sick?
Well, and generally, I think there's a couple of principles where holiday does carry forward. So the principles where holiday does carry forward automatically, generally, or is agreeable to at least, is maternity and sickness. Yeah. So the fact that you couldn't take holiday because you were sick or on maternity leave, it carries forward. So the 4-week restriction that you can't carry that forward under normal EU or Regulation 13 holiday doesn't apply. But I think there's an element of because I'm saying this from memory, and Rachel may have a view as well, and sometimes this is where we have our disclaimer at the beginning, and it's good to seek professional advice. Absolutely. Is that some elements of that are by agreement. So even if you look at the ACAS guidance, it'll say you can do it. It doesn't always say you have a right to do it. Yeah.
Let's move it over then to pensions auto-enrolment. I'm going to get you back involved here a little bit, Andy. Before we jump into this, it's just a quick commentary piece from Ian Davis. It says, the focus for HMRC for mileage rates should be the advisory rates, which cover the fuel costs only. The 45 pence a mile for using personal vehicles has always and continues to be more to cover the fuel costs, insurance, maintenance, etc. So just thought I'd mention all we have.
I think
good comment there.
Yeah, I think spot on. There's an element of what will the business for company car rates change to shortly. Now we have this 3-month review, and I guess there is some challenge of should HMRC wait for these 3-month reviews, or because they're so exponentially growing at the moment, should they be more frequent to allow? Otherwise, you get that point where it's expensive for someone to travel in their company car because the employer not funding it, the person is. That's probably how they feel a bit.
Sure. Let's jump into pensions auto-enrolment. Freezing of thresholds. Andy, take the floor, if you would.
Well, indeed, yeah. So hopefully everyone knows that the AE's threshold, the lower threshold, the trigger and the upper threshold are frozen, so there's no change for 22-23. They're just going to continue with the 21-22 thresholds. Normally, you may have noticed that Department for Work and Pensions, who set these thresholds, they've been sort of, the lower and upper have been mirroring the LEL and UEL for national insurance, and this is the first time for many years that they've disconnected that. So because the lower earnings limit went up for national insurance, you'll know from April, but the AE threshold, lower AE threshold has not. So and I think in part because the intention probably around 24, 25, 25, 26, maybe later. Anyway, sometime in the mid-2020s, the intention is that the lower threshold will go to zero, will be abolished. So therefore, if you keep increasing the lower threshold in line with national insurance at some point, the change when it goes to zero is going to be much bigger impact on employers. So it'll be interesting to see what happens for the April 23 thresholds. I don't know. That's down for DWP to decide to see if it continues to be frozen or maybe reduces or I don't know. See what happens. But they are frozen. So in other words, 21-22 AE related thresholds continue throughout the whole of 22-23 tax year. I just mentioned the mid-20s changes. The other intention is that the AE age threshold at which an individual can be automatically enrolled, as long as their earnings are enough as well, at the moment is 22, around about the mid-20s, 24, 25, 25, 26, wherever it is, and the intention is move that age down from 22 to 18. So whenever that happens, the lower threshold becomes zero and the age drops to 18, will be from in April, most logically. Then that particular payroll run, you're going to have quite a few more people being automatically enrolled, and also the employer contribution will be a lot more, subject to what happens in these intervening years for the lower threshold. The other thing to mention is that you may even have added to the consultation. HMT, Treasury, did a consultation about this anomaly we have for non-taxpayers, so individuals who are not paying tax. If they're in a relief at source scheme, so that's the tax relief method used for that pension scheme, such as Nest, for instance, or group personal pension schemes, they have relief at source tax relief method. That means that basic rate tax relief is automatically given to those people, even though they're non-taxpayers. They actually benefit from tax relief. So if they're paying 5%, if that's the scheme rules, 5% is minimum, basic rate tax relief would reduce that 5% down to 4%. So the individual in the relief at source scheme actually has deducted from their net pay 4%. That is their pension contribution, gets paid over to the pension provider. Pension provider then claims the missing 1%, the basic rate relief, from the HMRC, and that gets paid into the pension pot for that individual. So in total, 5% is in their scheme. So the individual has benefited. They've only paid 4%. But for those in net pay arrangement schemes, then the full 5% is deducted, and they would get tax relief through the payroll system because they're not paying tax. So there's no tax to give them relief on. So they will end up paying the full 5% without any tax relief. So to avoid this anomaly, to stop this happening, the government looked into it, Treasury have agreed, and the process is that HMRC will calculate what the missing tax relief is, the fact that they've actually paid, they've had less net pay. So that missing amount of net pay will be paid to them in the 25-26 tax year. So the first year they'll do the calculations is 24-25 tax year. They'll work out how much of non-tax relief that individual didn't get, or tax relief they didn't get, and then that amount, I don't know, maybe 10 quid, maybe more, £100, whatever it might be, will be paid to that individual. And it'll all be done through HMRC. And it's going to take a bit of time to get all that process in place, hence 24-25. So that's really good, because it means that it doesn't matter what pension scheme, what tax relief is being used. For non-taxpayers, they'll be treated equally. So it's really good. And the nice thing is it doesn't impact payroll, which is even better.
So that essentially is that mid-2020s proposal. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the mid-2020s.
Yes, it's one of the many.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is to do that. Yeah. There was Richard Holden MP put forward a private members bill, but the government, it's just going to run out of time, so it's not going to actually happen, because he was proposing to do the same things, reduce the low thresholds. And I think he was even talking about taking the trigger out so that everyone got enrolled without having no threshold from which to enrol. But that's all not going to happen, and we'll just wait for Department for Work and Pensions. There'll be plenty of advance notice, so it's not going to just happen without any advance notice. So payroll systems will be tweaked accordingly, and individuals be aware in terms of payroll users will know what to do when it comes to that particular tax year in which these things happen.
Sure. I've actually just had the one question come in relation to pensions. Perhaps this is more relevant for the salary sacrifice section. But it said for salary sacrifice pensions, do we need to show the full salary on the top line of the payslip with the employee pensions deduction under salary sacrifice on a separate line? Is there any specific guidance available on this?
Well, I do know back many years of payroll, you used to have to put the lower amount on your payslip, otherwise you were non-compliant. But HMRC have relaxed that, haven't they, Simon? So now you can put the full amount and the salary sacrifice value as well.
Right.
Yeah.
I think when it comes to payslip, you should think about whether you want to have notional pensionable pay on your payroll system so that you can get the system to calculate the employer contribution rather than having to do a manual calculation every period. So, or just to do it. So just think in terms of the practical aspects for maternity leave, salary sacrifice or non-salary sacrifice employer contributions. Just think how you can get the system to automate that for you to save you having to do lots of manual calculations.
Sure. Any additional commentary for yourself, Simon, in this section?
Yeah, only payslip law is actually very loose, so it doesn't actually require a lot. One of the areas where we have forgotten, I'm seeing people, is are required to put the various worked on a payslip. That is a legal requirement, and I think they got confused even during COVID between furlough and non-furlough, because it's working hours that are meant to be put on there unless it's only the contract. But on pensions, making the comment, whatever's useful is great. What legal requirement is there on a pay statement? Very little.
We've had it's obviously yes, obviously motivated a few additional questions to come in. So we're going to jump into the next section in just a moment. But last question while we're here. Yeah. If we have to remove an employee from salary sacrifice due to the new national minimum wage rates, is it the employee's responsibility to track when they could rejoin salary sacrifice, or the employer's?
There's no responsibility on either, to be honest. So it's whatever your scheme wishes to do. So there's no legal requirement to do anything. Yeah.
Right. Well, let's jump in.
Go along with that, I think, Rachel, wouldn't you?
Yeah. There's no formal requirement on either side.
Right.
Can I just add one thing, Nick? On the payslip front, really love employers to put the employer pension contribution on the payslip. I think it's very handy for employees to know how much the employer is paying. I think it's a real benefit. There's not a requirement, as Simon says, the legislation, even what format a payslip isn't directed. But it's really useful if you can, so that employees can see the value of the employer's contribution.
Yeah, I can agree more. As a recruiter looking at this space, attrition and retention, all those things, more information you can get to keep the employee happy, and you can do it. Why not do it? And fully in agreement on my side as well. I'll start with you. You can lead us into the 4th of April deadline, so people are aware of what they need to do.
Yeah. So, and we kind of had a bit of a holiday during COVID, although last year we had to do these reports, but I'm not sure if everybody did them, to be honest, or looking at some of the reports, how accurate they were, because I find it interesting when an employer reports that actually there is gender equality in all employment, thinking that's virtually impossible on a gender pay gap report. You could find it be close, but to be exactly zero difference looks like they've not understood the question. And not perform the calculations. However, all you've got to do is upload the result of the whole lot. But it looks to me, when they say no, zero on everything, we're equal, that they've not actually performed any calculation. It's just a personal view. So yes, public sector, your snapshot was 31st of March 2021.
Yeah.
Private sector, the snapshot was the 5th of April 2021. You need to get your reports in across the next 2 weeks. Yeah, so get your snapshot data from last year, do your calculations, get your board to analyse it. I don't know, is this more your thing? You tell us a bit more about gender pay gap report, Rachel. Yeah.
That's absolutely correct. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you will be feeling a bit weary given that it was October was the deadline because it was extended last year. So you will have done all this work not that long ago. And I do understand that this can be quite a task for payroll. There are a number of criteria I won't go into on what you have to report on. I think a practical piece of advice is if somebody within your organisation submitted the detail last time, then you do have to have another account opened in order to do it again this time. And I guess when you are collecting your data and you're trying to get board sign off, I'll say it as a woman, bear in mind the reason that, the policy was brought in. And I do understand that there is data that shows that from those that have to report, the gap has closed by a fifth for those organisations. And just going back to sort of your arena, Nick, in a candidate-driven market, I think female employees who show an aversion to employers that have a high gap, well, it's not going to do their sort of engagement and retention
absolutely right
many favours to have a big gap. That would be my view on it. Just make sure you do it in time. 30th public sector and 4th for everyone else.
It doesn't specifically relate to the gender pay gap necessarily, but after International Women's Day, which we recently celebrated, there were some interesting statistics released by the government and some of the research they've done that said that in relation to leadership roles here in the UK, we now have climbed to second in the international rankings for women's representation on boards at FTSE 100 level, with new data showing 40% of UK FTSE 100 board positions are now held by women, compared to just 12.5% 10 years ago. Major sea change, I think, really in terms of attitudes to getting women leaders to the top table of business in the UK, and actually not just the FTSE 100, which is 39.1%, but FTSE 250 is now 36.8%, FTSE 350 at 37.6%. So that's all positive stats coming out. Obviously a long way to go, but interestingly, while there's been lots of progress made at boardroom level, only 1 in 3 leadership roles and around 25% of all executive committee roles are held by women. So progress being made, but still a long way to go. And I think it's probably
that's where you see the gap, because the top end salaries, the gap is so big. I've seen it when I worked in house, at sort of middle management level. It is quite standard. And hopefully as these women progress through their careers, that gap will close. That's the dream.
We've certainly seen a big increase in salaries generally across the payroll industry. It's not specific necessarily to gender, but it's been nice to see, as Simon said earlier, the amount of work they put in during the pandemic is now starting to be recognised, with increases ranging regionally from between 5% to up to over 15%. So really positive for the payroll industry as a whole there in terms of the recognition being reflected in new salaries being offered. So I think that's a real positive sea change from what we see in the market. I realise we've got about a minute left. Is there anything else we need to mention here, Simon, in terms of how we prepare and submit these results? I think you may have covered it briefly already, but
yeah, I doubt there's very much I could say in the time left. Just some thoughts though. Are we addressing the reason for it in the first place, which was to elevate the lost women? I know it's an unusual term, isn't it? But the lost women were those that had left the workplace to become mothers or look after the elderly, and be able to elevate them back to an equal level when they return. And I'm wondering, are the strategies there to deal with the lost women?
Well, I think that there are
probably there.
Workplace changes are certainly helping with it. The ability to work from home now much more accepted in the world of payroll in particular than it ever was before. Hopefully that will certainly help those mothers and people returning to work who need to be at home for childcare reasons, whatever it might be. It gives them more accessibility. So I think that's a real positive sea change as well. So I'll take this huge opportunity to say thank you to our panel today, Rachel, Simon and Andy. The next payroll question time will be on the 8th of April. Please make sure you sign up for that. And thanks again to the panel and for all of you for joining us today on payroll question time. Enjoy the rest of the sunshine if it's still shining.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Payroll Podcast with Nick Day of JGA Recruitment. If you need help with a current payroll vacancy, then please get in touch with Nick and his team. All contact details can be found in the episode notes. In the meantime, to make sure you never miss a future episode, please subscribe to the show through any of your favourite podcast channels. Till next time.